Republicans in Congress are trying to literally rewrite the U.S. economy with no hearings, a couple of markups, but those are not hearings. We only just have been receiving some of the information of what's even in the bill to be able to then see what the effects are. And the reality is, we owe it to the American people to share how this bill will affect their wallets, their housing, their education, their health care. And, you know, contrary to what the majority would have you believe, this tax bill is yet another vehicle for Republicans to raise taxes on millions of middle-class families and reward the wealthiest and the largest corporations by handing them trillions of dollars worth of taxes. And, you know, I think that Democrats certainly would love to see, as my colleague said, real tax reform. And by that I mean tax reform that benefits the middle class and tax reform that would allow us dollars to invest in jobs, in infrastructure, in education, in health care. But the twist this time that I find interesting is that the Republican majority has mysteriously jettisoned its dogmatic fidelity to reducing deficits. Because this bill, make no mistake about it, however you slice it, this Republican tax bill will explode the budget deficits. Now, you talked about the two-step earlier, Representative Garamendi, and that's right, we're all going to be dancing a two-step, because what the Congressional Budget Office literally just released is an analysis that said that this tax bill will lead to an immediate $25 billion cut in Medicare. $25 billion cut in Medicare. Now, this bill has many provisions in it, and we've been talking about the state and local tax deduction elimination, and that is very important to my home state of Washington. We have about 800,000 people who were able to utilize that deduction and were able to reduce their tax liability by more than $2,600 in Republican and Democratic districts across our state. This deduction is significant to our communities because really it guards against double taxation. Now, the Fraternal Order of Police just came out against what I'm calling the Republican tax scam and the SALT deduction elimination in particular, the state and local tax deduction elimination in particular. And why did the Fraternal Order of Police come out against us? Because they understand the two-step that we're going to be dancing. They know that this tax bill and those kinds of deductions are ultimately going to lead to, and this is their words, endanger the ability to fund these essential law enforcement agencies that actually keep our communities safe. Now, another crucial mistake that the Republican tax bill makes is eliminating tax-exempt bonds. And for folks who are out there who are listening, the way to think about this is, if you have an affordable housing problem in your community, if you have a shortage of housing, which is happening across the country, then these tax-exempt bonds are the way that we help encourage and leverage local and state dollars for affordable housing with these tax-exempt bonds. They advance also vital transportation projects, and they support infrastructure projects in hospitals and colleges and charities. So, for example, in my district, Seattle Pacific University has been able to use these private activity bonds to finance nearly $42 million in construction and renovations to the library and to the School of Law. And similarly, the UW Medical Center has been able to use these bonds to finance critical medical research that has been beneficial across the country. Now, in eliminating several education-related tax deductions, the Republican tax bill is also cutting off valuable paths forward for students of all ages to not only improve their lives, also to join a workforce that depends on 21st century skills. And I know, Mr. Garamendi, that you spent a lot of time on this, but repealing the student loan interest deduction is in this bill. It would repeal the student loan interest deduction. Let me just remind people that we have $1.4 trillion in student loan debt across the country. That's actually more than credit card debt in this country. But this bill, in order to give tax cuts to the wealthiest largest corporations and wealthiest 1% of individuals, it would repeal that interest deduction for student loans. Now, in Washington State, that would harm more than 275,000 taxpayers in Washington State who claim that benefit, and it would raise their yearly taxes by more than $1,000 a year on average. And this bill also hurts our responsible employers who provide tuition assistance to help workers continue their studies at associate's or undergraduate or graduate levels. Tens of thousands of students in Washington State have benefited from this deduction, and that's true across the country. Nationwide, it's estimated that 70% of all companies offer tuition assistance. There's another provision in this bill that everyone should be concerned with, and that is eliminating the medical expense deduction. That deduction basically says that if you are suffering from a long-term, very expensive disease, if you have somebody in a nursing home and you have to pay for expensive long-term care for people, or maybe cancer, somebody who has cancer, that you can deduct medical expenses for those kinds of illnesses. And this bill says no more. So once again, in order to provide, for example, repealing the estate tax, which benefits 5,400 of the wealthiest families in this country, in order to provide that tax benefit, we're actually going to pay this critical tax deduction from regular working families around medical expenses. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the Republican tax bill repeals the new markets tax credit, which again was created really to incentivize investment in low-income and rural areas. And that tax credit is responsible for creating more than 12,000 construction jobs and an additional 11,500 jobs in related industries across my state, just as an example. So it's extremely short-sighted to repeal that, especially for an administration and a party that says that they care about investing in jobs and infrastructure. We haven't seen any package for jobs and infrastructure. I'm not sure if you have, but I certainly haven't. And the reality is that this bill, because of this two-step that you described, which, let me just remind people what that is, transfer trillions of dollars in wealth from the middle class to the largest corporations and the top 1%, and then, through exploding the deficit, which this bill does, suddenly trigger automatic cuts, as well as a rationale for cutting more from Medicare, from health care, from education, from transportation. That is what we're looking at. And early word on the Senate Republican tax bill seems to be just as bad, because I just heard before coming onto the floor that Senate Republicans are now saying that once again they are going to try to strip health care from Americans by including a repeal of the Affordable Care Act individual mandate, which my state knows exactly what happened, because we had a situation like that about a decade ago, and we had to dig our way out of that, because what it meant is that essentially health care became way too expensive for everybody. There were too many people who were not buying health care, so you were stuck with all the people who needed health care, who were very sick. It exploded costs, and literally, Americans across the country ended up suffering because of that. And now they weren't able to get rid of health care. 3 times we have beaten back the American people. Republicans and Democrats in urban and rural districts across the country said, no, we want our health care. Do not take our health care away from us. Once again, the Republicans plan to incorporate this provision and try to once again strip health care. So, Mr. Speaker, insanity is said to be doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, and I really fear for the threshold that we're crossing. I fear for our economy. I fear for our middle-class families. I fear for our low-income families. And I fear for the future of this country and for the future of our children, because the reality is what we should be doing, if we were going to raise money through tax cuts or through, taxing people more, we should be investing that money into infrastructure, jobs, healthcare. But not only are we not taxing, not cutting the taxes for people who need it the most, we're increasing their taxes to give a tax break to the wealthiest, and we're destroying all of the investments that we need to make into the U.S. economy and into our communities and into our middle-class families. So this is, I think, an incredibly important issue. I don't think people realize that the Republicans are trying to push through a vote on this bill this Thursday, as early as this Thursday. And I really believe that there are some Republicans across the aisle who have come out already and said that this is not a bill that helps our families, that helps our middle-class families and our communities. And they've been courageous to say that. And I want to thank them for doing that. And I want to urge other Republican colleagues across the aisle to do the same thing so that we can protect of our children and our families into the future. And I thank you so much for your leadership, Representative Garamendi, and for your constant speaking out on the need to invest in infrastructure and jobs, and I yield back.